Welcome once again to another edition of Election Countdown Nigeria. It's an exciting day and 31 days to go. This year, 17 African countries are going to hold state or parliamentary elections, including Nigeria. Elections in Africa have been marked by uncertainty or volatility. Nigeria is no exception. The relevance of social media is also something that has become a burning issue and is known to threaten electoral outcomes and also aggravate Nigeria's volatile political scenario, or it can be known to enhance the already cumbersome activities at the polls. Now, this is our special on Nigeria's elections holding on the 25th of February 2023. I am Osaogi Ogbonwa, and welcome to Election Countdown Nigeria on Breakfast Central. Welcome to Election Countdown Nigeria. Now, social media's influence on elections was evident in the early 2000s. If you remember, Barack Obama harnessed social media in his first presidential campaign to rally a majority of voters and eventually win the 2008 election. About 74% of internet users sought election news online during Barack Obama's first campaign, representing about 55% of the entire adult population at the time, according to a Pew Research Center. Now, in Nigeria, the End SARS movement of 2020 was incited by a huge percentage online. Of course, that's mostly on social media. Now, let's see how social media may affect Nigeria's election in days to come. It, of course, has been spoken about, and there have been certain comments that have also been made. We have that on the screen. As per a report, it has been discovered that political parties in Nigeria secretly pay social media influencers to spread information and disinformation about their opponents ahead of Nigerian elections. Now, to be precise, political parties in Nigeria are giving out cash, lavish gifts, government contracts, and even political appointments to get their work done through these social media influencers. There's, of course, been a back and forth. There's been a little back and forth about the use of social media. Some people have even made statements like, oh, so social media doesn't win elections. There's also been, I think, a comment about 4 people in a room tweeting that was made by a very popular, figure in Nigeria's political space. But let's move on. Situation rooms, where political parties strategize, develop plans, and monitor their campaigns' success, are also following how false narratives assigned to influencers are performing. In addition, fake stories are being developed to improve candidates' chances, and influencers have been asked to deliberately mislead the citizens to achieve the desired result. This has become one of the negative sides of social media in electoral process. And antagonistic state actors have also used social media to influence propaganda. We've also heard about troll farms and bots who have been used to leak false news stories and sow disorder. Now, joining us in Election Countdown Nigeria is political analyst and communication strategist, is also the managing editor of Avalon Daily, Mr. Adio. Thank you so much. Good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Now, let's talk about, we've seen how 2014 and the build-up to the elections in 2014 in Nigeria happened. And then, of course, now 2019 and 2023. How much influence would you say that social media currently has in Nigeria's election?
I think social media has a tremendous influence in shaping the narrative, which consequently shapes the outcomes, of political elections in Nigeria. And so I would say that it has a tremendous influence in actually nudging people to vote in one way or the other. And given the fact that as we speak today, you have well over 32 million people who are active on social media in Nigeria, and that's a tremendous amount of people who are being influenced by what they read, what they watch, and what they listen to on social media. So it's predominantly about the game of narratives, and who can effectively have his own narrative win the day is likely to win the elections at the end of the day. And so that's why social media is critical, and it's very, very, very effective. People who say that social media don't win elections have never been in a situation room of a political party before to see how candidates and their influencers struggle daily to create the right narrative for their candidate, or at least stop the tide against their own candidate.
Now, break down how this works, because, like you've said, there's 30 plus, million people on social media in Nigeria, and that's, across board, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and all the social media platforms.
Yes.
But people would argue that the majority of the people who vote, people in the marketplaces and whatnot, who don't necessarily have Twitter, who don't necessarily have Facebook or Instagram. Yeah. So can you explain how this works? And, you may want to use the current Labour Party's growth as an example.
So I think, again, this narrative is a bit lazy when people say that, market women are not on social media and so they cannot be influenced, by what happens on social media. I was coming down to the studio this morning, and the women who are, cleaning the streets on the road,
yes,
I saw about 6, I counted at least 6 of them who were watching clips on their Android phones while they were sitting down, taking a rest from their sweeping activity. So everywhere you turn, I ran an election in 2018 to 2019, and I landed in a community in Adamawa State. And the driver who was driving us to our hotel room had seen the candidate yesterday making a particular statement on Facebook, and I was shocked that he watched it on Facebook.
Yes.
So it's a lazy narrative when people say that market women and the poor people don't actually pick their news from social media, when in reality that is where they get most of their news from, because they do not buy newspapers.
Yes.
They can't afford to pay for cable TV in their homes. So many of them predominantly get their news from social media. So a huge amount of that demography are usually influenced by what happens on social media. And you also have to realize that when people talk about, when we say social media, I think a lot of people assume that we're just talking about Twitter, right? But WhatsApp is social media. Telegram is social media, right? And so despite being that a lot of people are not on Twitter, for instance, doesn't mean a lot of people are not on WhatsApp. You have a lot of old, retired people who are always sharing and sharing forwarded
messages. My mom. Okay.
And it's amazing how they believe what they see on WhatsApp and on social media.
Yes.
It's amazing. And so people who understand the name of the game always struggle to ensure that their narrative wins on social media. And I argue every single time, that elections are actually largely driven, by who wins the narrative, on social media. Remember, less and less young people are watching TV today. Less and less people are listening to radio today. Predominantly of citizens get their news from social media, and that's where the influence happened.
What he is, simply saying is that the spread and the penetration, the infiltration of social media is growing every day, and it's not slowing down, it's not stopping. But I want to ask about Nigeria. Sometime, not long ago, actually, there was a ban on Twitter by the Nigerian government. So let's talk about that, briefly before we take a break. How much, did that change? And, did the Nigerian government understand what it was doing in that moment? Was there a fear of social media use in that moment?
I think they were caught between, a rock and a hard place. They wanted to stop what they perceived as a huge propaganda on Twitter that was seemingly, or in their own arguments, steering an uprising in Nigeria, and was steering riots by their interpretation. And they felt that if they shut Twitter down, it was going to stop the tide of that narrative. So what they did not understand was, how this generation are predominantly dependent on social media. And so you had hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people boycott the so-called firewall, and using clever VPNs to be able to access Twitter. And a lot of people became more active, for instance, on Facebook, on WhatsApp and other social media platforms, to get heard, to get seen, to pass on their information, and so on. So at the end of the day, their efforts were a bit counterproductive, because people were still able to share information, they were still able to coordinate, they were still able to organize, and they were still able to spread their information, as far as they would. The only thing that they were able to do was to, in a way, shut out a bit of the intelligentsia who are predominantly on Twitter, as against Facebook and other social media platforms where the masses congregate, if you like.
All right. So when we come back, we're going to be talking about the proliferation of fake news also, and how that has also played a very, very dangerous and negative role with regards the elections in 2023 and even moving forward. Sure. Stay with us. It's Election Countdown Nigeria. We're going to be back right after this. This is Election Countdown Nigeria, and we have more for you this morning. And of course, still analyzing all the issues concerning the elections and the involvement of social media. Before our break, of course, we were talking about, the influence of social media, the Nigerian government's moves to ban social media. But a little fact checking shows that social media has a strong influence on voter decisions. Adio is still here with us. Now, let's talk about fake news. Right. It is a weapon. It travels really fast. A lot of times people use these things to sway voters left or right. Now, let's talk about how much of that exists in today's in Nigeria's social media space today. How influential that has also been.
I think there's a lot of fake news, and like I said, listen, the key operating word here is influence.
Yes.
And how you're able to manipulate the voter or sway a particular demography in one direction or the other. And that's where fake news comes into play, because these, in quote, strategies are playing on the impulses of people, and they are playing on parochial sentiments, they are playing on religious cleavages, and many of these sentiments that are easily divisive. And so what usually happens is that they create a narrative that they know is going to trigger a particular kind of reaction from a particular group of people, and then they fuel it in that particular direction. And the responses are always predictable. And so by the time that your fact checkers are coming out to say, okay, this is fake news,
too late.
The damage is already done. The impression has already been created. And in fact, many of the people who are seeing the news that is actually fake news have already been influenced by the first one that had already spread, right? So I have always argued that, a country needs as much armies fighting fake news as it does police officers on its road. Yeah. Because if you see how fake news have influenced certain decisions in the world, it will shock you. I mean, there's a Scandinavian study of how a troll factory in China forced the entire world into a lockdown by the clever use of social media to drive a certain kind of narrative, using bots who carried the names as professors and spread articles and clips across the world. And before you knew it, the entire world was parroting the same narrative of a lockdown, even when there was no evidence to suggest that a lockdown, was going to be effective in dealing with COVID, and it led to a global recession at the time. So these things are very, very, very tricky, and they could actually push countries into crisis if you're not careful. Yeah. And unfortunately, we see some of this fake news in our election cycle now. People, tapping into certain religious and ethnic sentiments and spreading false news in that regard to either energize a base or to anger a particular base to vote for their candidate or reject another candidate. And so as a country, as news organizations, we need more resources in the newsroom to be able to tackle this kind of disinformation before it takes over the entire space.
Can you point out any difference between the fake news and propaganda and the use of social media in 2014, in the build-up to election in 2014, and what we're seeing today?
So I think that in 2014, it was predominantly around a narrative of incompetence. So what the, in quote, strategists did in 2014 was to paint the president as a caricature, as someone who couldn't understand his left from his right and had no capacity whatsoever to govern the country. And so there were a series of narratives of how he used to sleep in meetings, how he was drunk before every meetings, how he couldn't even command the military, how he was weak, how he was controlled by his wife, and all of those things. And remember that in elections, people never go for replicas. They go for alternatives in most elections. And so what they cleverly did in that period was to contrast the personality of Goodluck Jonathan, who was a bit, calm, and portray the image that the country needed a strong and firm individual. And by doing that, they painted him as an incompetent caricature. This time around, unfortunately, what is being played out are religious and ethnic sentiments. And so you have very, very annoying, silly narratives that are being propagated on social media that tries to denigrate a candidate or cast aspersions on that candidate as though he was representative of a particular terrorist organization, for instance, to stoke fear in the hearts of other people to disregard that particular that narrative. And so that's the game that is being played this time around in the election cycle. And I think it's very dangerous, and it's something that we must find a way to deal with, because these things take root. And after February 25, you just cannot completely erase many of these fake news that are sunk deep in the hearts and minds of people. It is going to live on, longer than the election. And so it's the job of newsrooms, news organizations, national orientation agencies to ensure that they combat, this spread, this spread of fake news.
I'm not sure if they're doing well enough, as an agency. In the last couple of years, people have questioned their competence as an organization. Now, talk about the growth of, and this might be a great example in Nigeria's history of the Labour Party, through its candidate. How much influence did social media have, and is social media the future of Nigeria's electoral process?
So I think it's easier to analyze it if you think of social media as a medium of information dissemination.
Okay.
Right? And so before social media, for instance, in the 1979 elections, it was radio that was the predominant instrument for influence in many places in the northern part of the country, because many people tuned onto their radio in the mornings, afternoons, and the evenings. And so you needed the radio to shape your narrative, and every other propaganda was driven through the radio. Today, it is the social media as the medium for information dissemination. And so what has happened is that you have a crop of young people who are now using this social media to disseminate the information that they want to disseminate and to be able to organize effectively. Also, there is another issue that, media organizations and the gatekeepers in traditional media organizations are controlled by the establishment in Nigeria, the political establishment, who have influences in many of the media organizations. And so they do not give voice to many of the current demography that has sprung around the country. And so these people are now finding their own voices using social media with very little barrier for entry. And so what you're seeing now is a situation where, rather than write an article like it used to happen and post to the editor of the Vanguard or the Punch and wait for a response, whether or not he's on a good day to publish your article, you can just simply write an entire flow on Facebook. You can easily write an entire flow on social media, and then with a click of a button, you are reaching hundreds and hundreds of people. And there's a study that has found out that if you put certain cues in your tweets or in your Facebook posts that are against a particular group of people or an identity, your post is likely to have virality. And so that's why you see that Twitter is driven by this viciousness, this anger in the tone of the comments that you see, because virality actually is tied to your ability to stoke a particular kind of reaction from people from a certain group or from a certain demography. So I don't so much think that the Peter Obi candidacy is a function of social media as it is the fact that the demography that he influences, which are predominantly young, working class, educated people in urban settlements across the country, have a huge use of social media and get their information from social media and use that as a tool for disseminating information. And that's why you see this, what I would call the bandwagon effect, building around him, and the momentum building, around the particular candidate, of the Labour Party.
The one point, to note is that times have changed. Like you mentioned, the method through which information was disseminated, maybe 20 years ago is very different from now. The use of radio, the use of television, has reduced drastically, and there's more people who, in their own comfort zones will be able to get information, as quick as, it flies on Twitter, as quick as maybe it also flies on Facebook or on Instagram. Things are different. But of course, we must also appreciate the parts where it also is dangerous, and we've seen social media be the start of certain crises or protests or wars, even in certain places. So now take us back to 2020, the NSAS movement, which people say started mostly on social media, or was the fire basically started burning on social media before it got to the streets. Is that an example of how quick social media can create agitation and create protest in societies?
Oh, yes. Very, very, very quickly, because, you know, normally, before you got on, I use the NSAS, before traditional TV stations like yours got on the scenes,
yes,
you had people who had already gone on Facebook Live, who had gone on Instagram Live to already share information of what was happening on ground. And so that made it, you know, that triggered the virality of what actually happened. Like I said, when you capture a scene or a moment of guns being shot, it triggers a sense of reaction from people who are watching these live footages on their mobile phones, on their tablets. And so I think that alone, you know, helped fuel the kind of responses that we saw that particular night, you know, on social media. And so at a point, actually, you saw that citizens became very skeptical about traditional media. They had the perception that they probably wanted to cover up, and authenticity was going to be only found on social media. And so many more people started to seek information about the NSAS protest from social media, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy and continued to propagate itself that way up until the point to where it became a tool to mobilize people to the streets. Remember, it was done in Egypt. It was to social media, yes, that young people used to organize people to the streets. It happened in Tunisia. It happened, you know, in Syria. It happened in Hong Kong. You know, young people used social media because they could not move information across traditional media bureaucracies where the editor was skeptical, or the editor could be biased, or the editor had, you know, I mean, the decision was not just as easy as it is.
The level of control that governments also had, you know, with regards to information,
exactly,
you know, has also, you know, been thrown away, because in the past, you would wait for NTA, you know, you wait for, you know, your local television service to break the news to you. And, you know, that news could be doctored. It could also be, you know, created in a way to favor government. But these days, there's more independent journalists, there's more, you know, live reporting from people who aren't even journalists, you know, and some of all of that. So it's a beautiful world that we currently live in. But of course, on Election Countdown, we always introduce to you one candidate. And so for today, let's get into Know Your Candidate. My question, as always, as we count down to the elections, how many of the candidates do you know? Today, we'll bring you another political party, inundating you with all that you need to know. And for today's Know Your Candidates, in the countdown to the elections, we are going to be talking about the Action Alliance, AA. The party logo is a circle, a star, and of course, well, it's a star inside a circle, a circle inside a circle, and a star inside that circle. And with an eagle-like sign, the presidential candidate is Hamza al-Mustafa. For those of us who have been in Nigeria long enough, we should know that name not from the elections, but from a previous government, the Sani Abacha government. He was born in July, or 27th of July, 1960. He was the chief security officer to the late General Sani Abacha, who was Nigeria's military head of state from 1993 until his sudden death on the 8th of June in 1998. And he is the presidential candidate of the Action Alliance for the 2023 general elections. The former aide to late Sani Abacha says he will end Boko Haram in 6 months and will live in Sambisa Forest if he becomes the president of Nigeria. He's also pledged that his administration will do whatever it takes to tackle insecurity in the country. Also, that his administration would pay close attention to the rehabilitation of prisoners and convicts. It says police will be reoriented by separating the primary responsibilities of the police from secondary responsibilities, saying the primary responsibility of police must go to the police while the investigation goes to another body centrally. All right, and that's it for Hamza al-Mustafa, the presidential candidate of the Action Alliance. Quick reminder, do go get your PVCs and be a part of the elections. INEC has announced that more PVCs have been sent to your local government area. If you haven't gotten yours in the past, you've tried, just like myself, gone 6 times and, you know, without success, please go back to your local government areas if you're in Lagos and request for your permanent voters cards. Of course, remember also to know the party logos and the candidates, and remember to not sell your vote. Now, of course, this is where we wrap up on Election Countdown Nigeria 2023. Thank you so much to Adio for joining us and for being a part of the program this morning.
Thank you.
Good to see you.